Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is speaking out this week against opponents of the oil and gas industry. First, he announced a legal challenge of Bill C-69, the federal government's environmental assessment overhaul. He's also setting up a $30 million, quote, war room that will take on critics of the oil sands. And he started a public inquiry into foreign funding of environmental groups. But speaking to a group of oil and gas executives about these measures, Premier Kenney raised some eyebrows when he said this about critics of the industry.
Well, they know they couldn't get away with this in Vladimir Putin's Russia. In fact, you know, Greenpeace did do a protest on an offshore rig in Russia, and their crew was arrested and thrown in a Siberian jail for 6 months, and funnily enough, they've never been back. I'm not recommending that for Canada, but it's instructive. It's instructive.
So what did Premier Kenney mean by that? Jason Kenney is the Premier of Alberta. He joins us now from Calgary. Hi, Premier Kenney. Nice to see you again. Thank you for making time for our show.
Good to be back on the show.
I want to start off by asking you about a speech you delivered in Fort McMurray yesterday. In that speech, you were critical of groups that criticize Alberta's oil sands. And you said, quote, well, they know they couldn't get away with this in Vladimir Putin's Russia. In fact, you know, Greenpeace did do a protest on an offshore rig in Russia, and their crew was arrested and thrown in a Siberian jail for 6 months. And funnily enough, they've never been back. I'm not recommending that for Canada, but it's instructive. What did you mean by instructive?
Well, what I meant is that the groups that are campaigning constantly to landlock Canadian energy don't do the same thing in our major competitors like Russia, the OPEC countries, or Venezuela. They do virtually nothing to block energy production or exports from those countries. And overwhelmingly, they focus on this country with the highest human rights, labor, and environmental standards. My point is they apply a kind of perverse double standard to Canada. Yesterday, I was attacked by Amnesty International simply for responding to the foreign-funded campaign to landlock Canadian energy. My point is that I think the world would be a better place and human rights would be in a better situation if we had ethically produced Canadian energy competing with and displacing dictator oil that comes from some of the world's worst regimes with some of the worst human rights records.
I take that point. I think the point that, and I'm sure you know, that sparked certainly questions is the idea that it would be instructive. I mean, Russia is not known for its human rights record. In fact,
that's my point.
But what is your point, though? I don't understand, because you're saying it sounded like you were saying. One second, sorry. It sounded like you were saying what happened to them, what happened to protesters there is instructive, as in, should we have a similar atmosphere here?
My point very clearly is that the groups that are effectively ganging up on Canada to landlock our energy exports do nothing to impede energy exports from some of the world's worst regimes. And my point is,
but in this protest, they did do something, right? They were trying to do something.
Well, and they haven't since, and they certainly don't in Iran or Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or Qatar. And for that matter, not to say, the United States is a country with the rule of law, but the United States has doubled its oil production in the past decade with none of the same U.S. foundations trying to block American oil production or exports. The campaign against Canadian energy has been prejudicial and I think counterproductive because it's been landlocking the country with the highest human rights records of any major energy producer on Earth. And my point is that more Canadian energy means a more stable world because of less dependence on Russian and OPEC energy.
But you're trying to make the point that these groups are only protesting Canadian oil by saying that they protested the situation in Russia.
Once, and they haven't been back, was my point. My point is
that because of how Russia treated them? Is that what you're trying to say?
My point is they would never bother going into Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or Iran or Qatar or most of these countries because they'd be thrown out. My point is that we are a liberal democracy. We celebrate that fact.
Isn't that a good thing?
But I find it ironic that these organizations focus overwhelmingly their anti-energy campaign on the country that has the highest environmental human rights and labor standards of any major oil and energy producer. And I think they're wrong to do so. I think they're wrong to give effectively a free pass to the countries with which we compete on global energy markets while trying to landlock this country, which, by the way, is constantly improving our environmental practices. Just this week, Suncor announcing a project that's going to reduce by a quarter its greenhouse gas emissions. Where are the environmental groups celebrating that rather than trying to shut us down and landlock our energy?
So in order to prevent prevent that, should we be treating them the same way those countries you listed off do? Russia, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia. So
I said exactly the opposite in my speech. I said exactly the opposite. I said this is exactly what we should not do. We celebrate the fact that we respect civil rights. I respect the freedom of speech of these organizations. But if they're going to lie about our environmentally responsible production of energy, then we're going to tell the truth about the Canadian record. We believe that the world would be better off if we could compete with or displace OPEC Russian energy as opposed to allowing them to monopolize global energy markets.
You didn't, though, explicitly say Canada should never do that. You said, I'm not recommending that for Canada, but it's instructive.
Of course we shouldn't do that. Of course. I've used the same line, by the way, dozens of times. I wasn't asked any questions about this yesterday or today by Alberta media. This is a typical fake Twitter outrage. The truth is that these organizations, Amnesty International, the context was that yesterday they issued a letter suggesting that Alberta was somehow violating human rights by launching an inquiry into the foreign sources of funds behind the campaign to landlock Canadian energy, the so-called tar sands campaign, which has been supported by groups like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Hewlett-Packard Fund, San Francisco hedge fund billionaire Tom Steyer, groups that have collectively spent tens of millions of dollars to massively damage our economy, to landlock our energy, while the U.S. has doubled its energy production, and they've done virtually nothing to impede energy production or shipments from OPEC dictatorships or some of the world's worst regimes.
I
make no apology for pointing out the double standard.
Yeah. But I think the concern espoused by Amnesty International and maybe others is, let's say, and even apart from Amnesty International, let's say that your frustration over that criticism, it's understandable, it's genuine. Are you worried about, by using rhetoric around this kind of event in Russia, for example, by talking about people who criticize the oil sands in the way that you are, that you're creating an environment that is risky for them, that is dangerous for them, that is sort of saying you can't express, and I take your point on the foreign funding, and I know that's a whole other subject, but say you're just a person who disagrees with the level of output of emissions in the oil sands. Like, are you creating an environment where someone vocalizing that is going to be, more in danger?
No, it's called a public debate, Vashi. Nobody should be in danger for the people or the government of Alberta expressing the truth about how we produce energy in response to a campaign of defamation and lies. Nobody should be in danger for us trying to create some greater transparency around the foreign sources of funds behind the anti-Alberta energy campaign. This is called a legitimate public debate in which we are engaged. For too long, we've allowed one side of that debate to completely dominate it, and that side has been very effective. They got Justin Trudeau to kill the Northern Gateway pipeline, to kill Energy East. They got President Obama to veto Keystone XL, and Mr. Trudeau to surrender to that. They got the bungling and the delays on Trans Mountain. They got court delays on Keystone. They got Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines Law, Bill C-48, the ban on Alberta energy exports off our northern coast. And so they've been very effective at massively damaging the economic interests of Alberta and Canada. And so I feel not just a right, but a responsibility to respond with the facts.
But you're not just responding with the facts. You're saying if there's a line that people can call or send emails to if someone is espousing the other side, right? Like, it's not just saying, let's have a debate based on the facts. You want to stifle the other side.
No, to the contrary. I've said I respect the freedom of speech of people with a different view on energy development in Canada. They exercise that, and they have every right to, just as we have a right and a responsibility in defending the public interest to respond in kind. We ran on a commitment to Albertans, won a historic Democratic mandate with actually the largest Democratic mandate in Alberta history, partly to launch a public inquiry into the foreign sources of funds behind the campaign to landlock Alberta energy, part of which is just an open opportunity for the public to offer information or suggestions. That's how a transparent government operates.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm unfortunately out of time, but thank you very much, Premier Kenney. I apologize. I'm mixing up my federal and provincial elections. Yeah. Thank you, Premier. Have a great day.
Thanks, Vassy.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.